Good afternoon, everybody. Everybody awake after lunch? Yeah? Okay, good afternoon. Perfect. Welcome. Welcome to the second annual State of Women in Engineering session. I'm Jonna Gherkin, the FY18 president of the Society of Women Engineers. SWE is a nonprofit professional organization with more than 38,000 members. It was founded in 1950, and our mission is to advance women in engineering and technology. Women have increased their numbers in many professions previously dominated by men, including law, business, medicine, and other STEM fields. However, currently less than 15% of engineers in the US are women, and that number has been stagnant since the early 2000s. Women engineers of color not only face gender disparity in engineering and technology, they also deal with issues related to race, ethnicity, and culture. Today, we hope to give you a better understanding of the state of women in engineering, especially engineers of color. The content that will be discussed comes from SWE's own research, as well as important data collected from partners in our community. We hope to convey what's driving the gender gap in STEM and inspire you to help us achieve parity for women in engineering and technology. To tell us more about the state of women in engineering, please welcome Peggy Layne, Assistant Provost for Faculty Development at Virginia Tech.
Thank you, Jonna, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to get started today by sharing some data with you about women in engineering. As engineers, we like to see the numbers, so I've got a few bar charts and graphs for you. All right, where are they? There they are. Okay. So this is data from the National Science Foundation's biennial report on women, minorities, and persons with disabilities in science and engineering. And if you can't see in the back, that shortest bar there in the middle of the graph is engineers. So women currently make up about 14% of the engineering workforce in the United States, and you can see that as a percentage of professionals, we lag behind scientists and engineers in other disciplines and in non-science and engineering occupations. This is a number that has climbed slowly over the years. So if you attended this presentation last year, I can assure you that I have updated these slides, but you probably wouldn't notice it to look at them. The American Society for Engineering Education collects data every year on the number of engineering degrees awarded at colleges in the United States and Canada. And this graph shows you engineering degrees, bachelor's degrees in engineering awarded to women by discipline as a percent of the total. So in 2016, with the most recent data available, women earned just under 21% of all the bachelor's degrees awarded in engineering. And that's a number that has varied between 18 and 22% for about the last 25 years. What this graph is showing you is the variation in the percent of women by engineering discipline. So the high bars on this side of the graph are in engineering disciplines like environmental and biomedical and agricultural engineering, which have relatively high percentages of women, between 30 and 45% of bachelor's degrees awarded. Those short columns on the far end include mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and computer engineering. And those are, in fact, the largest disciplines of engineering in terms of numbers of degrees awarded. So almost half of the engineering degrees in the United States in recent years have been in the area of mechanical engineering, which continues to have one of the smallest percentages of women, down around 12%. One area where we have seen progress in recent years is the percentage of women on engineering faculties. So women now make up about 16% of all engineering faculty members and about 24% of assistant professors, which would be the entry-level faculty position for people who've recently completed their Ph.D.s. And that 24% is pretty much on par with the percentage of women earning Ph.D.s in engineering. So women are about as well represented in the junior levels of the professoriate as they are, as we are producing women with those qualifications. When you get up to the more senior level of full professor, only about 11% of women at the most senior level, of professors at the most senior level are women. Women are closer to parity with men in terms of salary in engineering than in other types of employment. So you can see here that engineers are relatively well compensated compared with all full-time workers in the United States, and these are census data from the most recent data available from the American Community Survey, which is what replaced the long form of the US Census, if you remember that. And again, those salaries vary across engineering disciplines, and the degree of parity varies. So you can see here that in chemical engineering, women are pretty much on par with men in terms of average salaries, where there's still some disparity in electrical engineering, but those disparities tend to be smaller in engineering than in other scientific disciplines and in employment as a whole across the United States. So to tell you some more about the research available on women in engineering, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Peter Meiksins.
Thanks, Peggy. I hope everyone can hear me. All right. So I'm not telling you anything new if I point out that this was a year in which the issue of gender in engineering and technical fields was actually front page news. Thanks to Peggy for finding the front pages that appear there. Right? This was a year in which we heard entirely too much about a culture of harassment in technical occupations and technical fields, started by the revelations by a former Uber engineer about what happened there, followed by revelations about a culture of harassment among venture capitalists in the Silicon Valley. The stories go on and on. The problems got bad enough that there was actually a New York Times article in September, I hope someone here saw that, it was very interesting, on how men in the Silicon Valley thought that the efforts to promote gender equity had gone too far, that they felt beleaguered as women complained about the culture of harassment. So this is now front page news. It's not simply an issue that's buried in dusty tomes in academic research facilities. This is now something that's a current policy issue. There isn't a persuasive account out there, I don't think, of why this is so pervasive a problem in technical fields in particular. But one thing that jumps out when you read accounts of what goes on in the tech fields is that the issue of numbers is at the root of the problem. That in a situation where there are very few women and there are lots of men, and all of the powerful positions are occupied by men, that's a very fertile breeding ground for the kinds of problems we read about. So the sorts of issues that we've tried to address in the literature review at least bear significantly on this problem, because that's been the focus of most of what we've been trying to summarize, which namely the question of why there are so few women in engineering, specifically in technical fields more broadly. So one aspect of what we've done is to talk a bit about why women don't choose to study engineering. It used to be felt that maybe the problem was a leaky pipeline, and I'll talk about that metaphor in a moment. But increasingly, if you read the literature on women in engineering, the questions really focus on the issue of why so few women entered the field in the first place. There's been a lot of research on that. We reported on some of it this year. Essentially, three major themes jumped out of the research that we reported on this year. First, the feeling among women who might be interested in moving into the field, who had the appropriate kinds of qualifications, that engineering wasn't consistent with their primary career goals. A second was the experience of doubt that some women encountered as they began to travel the path towards an engineering career. And then finally, the perception that the field was overwhelmingly male, masculine, I should say, and that this didn't seem like a place where I belong if I'm female. Just to elaborate a little bit on those things, the research we reported on, and this is not a new finding, this gets repeated every year. We often talk among ourselves about the literature review as Groundhog Day, that we often find the same things being said over and over again, and nothing ever seems to change, as Peggy just pointed out. But this is a kind of recurring theme that women who are interested in engineering also are often interested in improving the world, working with people, and doing things along those lines, and that the field isn't perceived as offering those kinds of advantage, or those kinds of rewards to people who aspire to it. It's sometimes presented as a public relations issue that engineering doesn't know how to sell itself. But I think more fundamentally, what the research is showing is that while that's true, engineering also has to deliver on the promise that it actually offers people the opportunity to do these kinds of things. And if it doesn't, people pretty quickly figure out that that's not what's going on here, and so they leave, or they just don't go in the first place. So it's not just a matter of presenting oneself more effectively, it's also perhaps changing the overall focus that may be prevailing in certain fields. The self-doubt issue, there's, as we all know, an increasingly large number of women who are math competent. We can no longer point to calculus as the obstacle to women's entering engineering, which Sally Hacker did famously 30 years ago. If anything, women out-achieve men in math at this point. But what the research we read this year pointed out is that as women move into, and men move into engineering study, they often find out that they're not necessarily the best person in their class any longer. And that men and women respond to this differently. Women tend to it's a little bit like first-generation college students not feeling they belong. Very similar kind of issue here. Women may sort of internalize the feeling that perhaps my not being best means I'm not good enough. Men, by contrast, tend to blame their professor. Which also has the interesting side effect that men are more likely to fail engineering programs than women because they persist in spite of the evidence that they're actually not doing very well. But that's a sidebar. The point is that the experience of self-doubt may sour some people on the field, and apparently this affects women more than men. When you compound that with the experience of bias, which most women report at some point along the way, one can see that the social psychology of entering engineering may work against increasing the numbers of women. The field is also perceived as masculine. It's perceived as not for women, and the kinds of sexual harassment stories that one hears that I just alluded to certainly don't help create the impression of the field as a welcoming one in which women feel at home and feel that they belong. So those are explanations offered as to why women may not be entering engineering in large enough numbers. Then there's the leaky pipeline metaphor, which I referenced earlier. If women do enter engineering, but then they leak out, if they leave the field at some point along the way, then increasing the numbers of women entering is sort of a Sisyphean task. The question really is a twofold question. Do women leave engineering education? So in other words, do they start engineering programs and then not get a degree, switch to something else, switch into accounting or some other math-related field? And then secondly, do women who complete engineering degrees leave the field either right after or subsequently having embarked on an engineering career? The answer to the first question appears to be no. Right? That although there was for a long time a feeling that women were leaving engineering programs in larger numbers than men, or in larger percentages, the answer actually turns out to not be the case. The numbers of women who leave engineering are not remarkably high compared to the numbers of men. There's obviously attrition in engineering programs, but it seems to be gender neutral to a great extent. So the problem isn't women hating circuits and leaving. It's something else. If people hate circuits, that's a universal feeling. It's not just women. Right? Okay, so there's that. Now the second question, however, that we do find some evidence that there's truth in that, and the numbers you recited on the percentage of degrees going to women and the percentage of women in engineering kind of tell you a statistical version of that story. There is considerable evidence that women are more likely than men to leave the field after having earned a degree. And so that raises the question of why that's the case. Right? Now, again, there's a lot of reasons that we can talk about, some of which have been recited in previous literature reviews and previous presentations at this meeting. I wanted to kind of focus attention this time on an article we read this year, which I thought gave some interesting new perceptions on why women leave. This is an article by a team of researchers headed by Carol Sarin, who's a sociologist at, I think, at UCLA, who did some interesting work based on a sample from 4 East Coast engineering programs looking at graduates and current students. And what they told is a kind of story of a slow process of discouragement that affected women who moved through these programs at various steps along the way. It started during the educational process, but then kind of resulted in a decision to leave after. So they told the story of the women entering the program and discovering, as I referred earlier, that they're not the best student in the class, and reacting by doubting themselves a bit. Right? Then that continues. One of the basic core components of most engineering curricula now is teamwork. A lot of faculties organize their students into teams to simulate the kinds of work students will do later in the engineering workplace. And what Sarin and their colleagues found was that in these college-based teams, the women did the managerial work and the men did the technical work. Right? So the women took notes, organized the team, and the men played with toys, played with the devices, and measured things and did engineering stuff. Right? And that this began to send a rather subtle signal about the gendered character of engineering, that the actual engineering work was boy work, right? And what the girls got to do was not engineering. And this began to create a question in people's minds of whether I belong here. That was then exacerbated when women moved out into the workplace, initially through summer jobs and internships, experiencing actual workplaces through co-op or whatever, where they discovered much the same sort of thing, a very highly gendered workplace in which most of the workers were men, and where women were stereotyped as being appropriately assigned particular kinds of roles, which mimicked the ones they got in these school-based teams. Right? They also encountered the male culture of the workplace, which we talked about earlier. And what they found was that this compounded over time, and by the time women graduated, some of them had sort of come to the conclusion that this is not for me. Right, and moved into other fields which their engineering degree qualified them for. And they argue that this kind of gives you an explanation for why the leak in the pipeline occurs where it does. So, to finish up, sociologists are accused of being depressing, right? Which there's 2 of us, and I think we'll own that, right? But at any rate, we did actually find some things that at least purport to be solutions in the literature. In the research we reported on this year, we pointed to 3 things, or 3 types of solutions that researchers had pointed to. One was various kinds of efforts to address that self-doubt issue that I made a mention of earlier. And several researchers talked about curricular approaches which emphasized hands-on work, which emphasized student-centered learning, which put the student at the center of the experience, which they found had a very positive effect on women's self-confidence and sense of capability in doing technical work, that a simple kind of technical adjustment to the curriculum might actually pay off in terms of higher levels of self-confidence among women. We also reported on several studies, including a major book, which emphasized the importance of addressing the whole issue of work and family. And again, a recurring theme in discussions of women in the technical workforce. Sociologists like to talk about a cultural lag here, that engineering and other professional workplaces continue to assume that their employees are what Joan Williams called ideal workers, who have an unemployed full-time spouse at home taking care of the household, right? That's not the reality for men or women in the 21st century, and this has become a major problem as more women have entered the workforce. They have not entered the workforce not wanting to have families, right? And workplaces have yet to adjust fully to that reality, and this disadvantages women more than it does men, although it disadvantages increasing numbers of men, as the book that we reported on emphasizes. Now, what you'll notice, and as I was preparing these notes, I was thinking about this, a lot of the solutions that you encounter in the literature are narrow. They focus on a thing, and it's not always the thing that the literature says they ought to focus on. There's actually arguments about whether work-family is the issue, right? But a lot of the research on solutions focuses on that almost to the exclusion of everything else. So I wanted to emphasize the lessons of the NSF Advanced program here, because there's a lot of research now coming out reporting on the early generation of NSF Advanced programs, which are now quite mature and have been there long enough to begin to show results. And what you'll see in reports on NSF Advanced programs is reports about how they sometimes succeeded. They sometimes succeeded because the success or failure of the program depended, in the accounts that we read, on whether or not there was high-level leadership willing to commit to the program, whether significant resources beyond what NSF provided were devoted to programs, and whether there was a real collective will to change, right? So, I mean, what it basically said was, you can change this thing, but you have to want to, right? And you have to try, right, in an organized, purposeful way. If you do, it sometimes actually works. So I found myself wondering, what would happen if there were an NSF Advance outside the university? Is that what it requires to make the kinds of systematic changes that would alter the culture that seems to present all these kinds of obstacles to increasing the numbers of women beyond that magical 15% plateau that Peggy mentioned? So with that, I'll stop. We obviously will continue to be doing literature review, and I'll turn it over to Kacey Beddoes, who'll talk a bit more about some of the research we were reporting on. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. All right. So in this year's literature review, we saw two notable trends that advanced the research landscape by drawing methodological and theoretical inspiration from other fields. The first was a growing recognition of the need to critically examine faculty members in order to better understand gender in undergraduate engineering education. This year we saw articles published in the Journal of Engineering Education, the European Journal of Engineering Education, Studies in Higher Education, Engineering Studies, as well as ASEE conference papers that take faculty members rather than students as their study population for examining gender in undergraduate engineering education. For example, an article published in the journal Engineering Studies by Emily Blosser discusses how engineering professors from different disciplines explain women's underrepresentation by invoking gendered images that position some engineering disciplines as masculine and others as feminine. We also saw an article published in the Journal of Engineering Education by Elizabeth Blair and colleagues, and they identified 3 discourses that professors use to construct gender identities and their identities as teachers. And so those were gender blindness, gender acknowledgement, and gender intervention. And they concluded that professors most frequently utilized discourses that limited their responsibilities to promote equity, and that this highlights the pernicious nature of systemic gender bias. So this group of studies really is an important advancement in the research landscape in that it moves beyond studies that only look at students. The second topic I'll be talking about is intersectionality, which Heather Metcalf will also talk about after me. Over the past few years, we've seen a growing trend in a recognition of the importance of intersectional gender research. And that means research that explores multiple intersecting facets of identities such as gender, sexuality, race, and class. So this year we were pleased to see not only a continued upward trend, a continued upward trend in the number of papers that are engaging intersectionality, but also advances in the type of work that's being done. And so those advances were both conceptual and methodological. On the conceptual side, we saw greater engagement with a broader range of intersectional issues beyond race or ethnicity, most notably non-binary gender and sexuality studies. So for example, we reviewed an ASCE paper by Rode, Kern, and Godwin on nuanced gender identities that suggested that students who identify as cisgender, that means someone who identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth, that those students could play an important role in helping non-cisgender students develop a sense of belonging in engineering. And that paper also includes important information on how to make demographic sections of surveys more inclusive of a broader range of gender identities. Another paper that conceptually advanced intersectional research on gender and sexuality was Alfrey and Twine's Gender Fluid Geek Girls, which appeared in Gender and Society. And this was a workplace study that describes a spectrum of belonging in which white and Asian women who identify as LGBTQ and gender fluid faced fewer microaggressions, had a greater sense of belonging, and were perceived as more competent than conventionally feminine heterosexual women. And so the authors argue that this spectrum of belonging reinforces inequality regimes that privilege male workers. Methodological advances included the development and testing of new survey instruments that are designed to better examine the experiences of women of color in engineering. One survey by Cross and colleagues at UIUC is called the Womanist Identity Attitude Scale, and it was created from a combination of the most relevant previously published and validated scales in order to produce a holistic instrument to investigate the experiences of women of color. A second survey, titled the National Survey of Women Engineering Faculty by Cox and colleagues, was created to understand why and how faculty women of color persist in engineering. And this survey was a wholly original instrument. It's currently being validated and pilot tested. So both of these survey instruments represent important advancements in intersectional gender research in engineering. And they were described in ASCE papers, so we look forward to seeing the findings that emerge from the use of the instruments in articles in the coming years. And now we'd like to tell you about the research being conducted by the Association for Women in Science. Please welcome Dr. Heather Metcalf, the Director of Research and Analysis at AWIS.
Thank you, Kacey. Hopefully you can see me behind this laptop. I'm not as tall as our other presenters. Okay. So a topic that I'm going to build on that Kacey started to address is intersectionality. It raises the question for me of when we report on the state of women in engineering, which women are we talking about? Often we frame research and conversations on women in scientific and engineering disciplines as if they're a unified or homogeneous group. And when we do that, it prevents us from seeing the rich diversity among women as well as men and gender minorities in scientific and engineering fields. It inhibits our ability to learn from their experiences and create scientific and engineering environments that value, recognize, and advance all scientists and engineers. So in this presentation, I will be sharing highlights from our most recent AWIS report, which is entitled Beyond a Buzzword, Exploring Intersectionality to Revolutionize Our STEM Workplaces. And I'll be using examples from national level data, our own original survey on STEM workplaces, and also some data that's been published by the American Physical Society. So first I want to start with this idea of what is intersectionality, and Kacey started to provide a description of this, and I just want to expand on it a little bit more. Hopefully you can hear me over the drilling that's happening next door. I'll try to speak as loudly as I can here. So intersectionality has been around for quite some time as a concept for examining interlocking systems of power and oppression. For example, Sojourner Truth's activism in the mid-1800s called attention to differential experiences of oppression had by white women and black women, and the functioning of racism within suffragist movements, in her famous Ain't I a Woman speech. Throughout U.S. history, women of color like Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Jerry Moraga, as well as others, have called for our gender equity work to look more closely at what we mean and who we include or exclude when we talk about women's experiences. Intersectionality as a framework allows us to do just that. It guides us in situating and interpreting experience within various social, political, economic, environmental, and historical contexts. The systems that shape our experiences of identity cannot ever really be separated, even though we study them very frequently in this way. For example, a black disabled woman does not experience her engineering workplace only as a woman, a black person, or a disabled person, but through her own unique interaction with the systems in which she is situated. Intersectionality also allows us to make visible similarity across difference and difference across similarity. When we look at intersectionality and how it has been used specifically within STEM workplace research, and again, Kacey pointed some of this out, that it's growing over time. We looked at Scopus database articles published from 1993 all the way through last year. And you can see that among the nearly 3,000 articles that have been looking at intersectionality as a whole, only 52 of those were on STEM workplace research. So this graph shows the different categories that are included within that intersectionality research. So the blue bar is the STEM workplace research, and the peach-colored bar is the general research. And we can see overall across all of that research that the primary emphasis has been on gender and race and ethnicity, but it's even more so when we're looking at scientific workplaces. In particular, it's of interest to me that there are a few categories here that are rarely, or if at all, included within the work that we explore within STEM workplaces. So for example, looking at things like class, religion, and sexuality, those are rarely included within STEM workplace research, and disability was not included in any of the studies that were in the Scopus database. There are a number of different challenges that come into play when we are trying to do this type of research. So that may create a disincentive for people to start to incorporate more of these different social structures and identity categories in the work that they're doing. So first is a number of different balancing acts. One is privacy and inclusion. So when we are conducting this research, the more identity categories that we include, the more systemic components that we include, the smaller the numbers are. And so the more inclusion that we have puts the research in a position where you may be revealing someone's specific identifiable information. So we have to be careful when we're doing that. The other issue is balancing meaning and significance. So when we're reporting on a lot of these things, we often prioritize statistical significance, over looking at meaning in the data. And so we will drop small sample sizes, even though those may be the very populations that we're interested in including the participation of in our scientific workplaces. Some other challenges that come up are obtaining timely data access. So a lot of the surveys that we have out there already at a national level don't include a lot of the kinds of categories that best represent people's experiences. So then we are having to collect our own data, which takes a lot more time to test out those survey instruments or interview protocols. Also, handling outmoded, missing, or shifting social categories presents a large challenge, as well as situating and interpreting the data within context. So intersectionality, again, is looking a lot at systemic issues, and so that requires that we understand the context surrounding the data that we're collecting. I want to give a couple of examples here of how we've done this in our report and what it helps us understand differently about our scientific workplaces. So first, research exploring retention in STEM often focuses on gender alone and attributes women's departure from STEM for non-STEM jobs largely to family-related reasons. As Peter pointed out earlier, that's the solution we focus in on the most. However, when we look at the national level data, and this is from the National Science Foundation CSTAT database from their 2015 data, we see that there's a very different story. So when we include race and gender together, family reasons are the primary reasons provided for leaving a person's STEM degree field when they're in the workplace, only for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander women. Job unavailability also is a high reason for this group of women. And across all of the other different racial categories, we see a lot of nuance that's there. So for white women, we see pay and promotion, change in interest, and job unavailability as things that come up kind of in parallel. They're named at the same rate. For Hispanic women, it's working conditions. For Black women and American Indian and Alaska Native women, it's job unavailability. And for Asian women, it's pay and promotion. So we can see that it's a much more complicated story about attrition that we have here when we look at gender and race together. When we incorporate disability in the mix, the rationale that's provided also shifts again. So for Asian women, American Indian, and Alaska Native women, their reasons shift primarily to working conditions, and for white women, it shifts entirely to job unavailability for women with disabilities. Another example that I'd like to share has to do with a topic that's already come up here today, which is our STEM workplace climate and culture. The issue of harassment has come up a lot over the last year, as Peter mentioned, and the STEM workplace harassment research focuses primarily on sexual harassment, but intersectionality approaches also show that harassment and exclusion by gender, race, sexuality, and disability also occur. So it reminds us that systemically, harassment is a behavior that's about power and not about sex or attraction. So the first graph that I have here on the left is from the American Physical Society's data. So they had 324 physicists who replied at a national level to their survey. And what they found was a wide difference in experiences of harassment among these physicists who identify as LGBTQ. So the rate at which harassment is experienced for LGBT women is 3 times the rate as LGBT men. For gender nonconforming physicists, it's 4 times the rate, and for transgender physicists, it's 5 times. So these nuances make a lot of difference in the experiences of harassment. The other thing I want to point out is from our AWIS survey that we conducted last year with 327 of our AWIS members. And what we did was we looked at a number of different factors that influence sense of belonging within our scientific workplaces. So the chart that I have here on the right of this slide shows among those respondents that we had in our survey who identified as persons with disabilities, We looked at their comfort in sharing their disability within their workplace and revealing that aspect of who they are, and we also incorporated in gender and race and sexuality into the mix. And so what we see when we look at this is that women of color are the most likely population to express a high level of discomfort in their workplaces relative to their experiences with disability and sharing that aspect of who they are and what they experience in the workplace. And this is even more so when those women of color also identify as LGBTQ. So I just wanted to offer up a few recommendations based off of doing this work for folks who are collecting additional data within their organizations or even within national level societies. So the first is to remember that the challenge is really worth it. Even though I listed all of those challenges at the beginning, it helps us learn a lot of new information that we wouldn't have known otherwise by incorporating intersectionality into the work that we're doing. So whether we're using existing or gathering new data, whether we're using a quantitative or qualitative approach in our research and to inform our policy and practice, there are lots of ways to incorporate this framework. So the first thing is to largely remember that this is a systemic focus and to be sure to weave it into all of the aspects of the work that we're doing. And it's not just about disaggregating and reaggregating data, but looking at what kinds of questions are you asking, what assumptions do your policies and programs make about who is impacted and who is included, whose voices have you not yet heard and whose experiences have you not yet looked at. Analyzing the data from an intersectional approach, even when the N is small, as I mentioned earlier, these are often the very groups that are most underrepresented in our scientific disciplines. So without understanding the experiences of these folks, then we can't make changes that will also help include them better into those environments. Gathering data on social categories and options that are often neglected and dropped from studies. Just the act of including these categories has a really huge impact on sense of inclusion for participants who rarely see themselves reflected in the studies. So the quote that I have on the right of this slide is something that we got back a lot on our survey. We had open-ended questions asking for people's input on the categories that we offered and the response options. And so many people said things like, wow, thank you for allowing so many answer possibilities. This is the first time I've ever seen this part of my experience or who I am included in this. And that says a lot about what your organization the level to which your organization values me as a person. Incorporating qualitative elements in the work that you do allows to provide for the providing of context. So whether it's conducting interviews or adding these open-ended kinds of questions to surveys or analyzing policy document texts or historical documents, it allows us to situate the findings that we have and to understand how participants are reacting to the very questions that we're asking. And then as a researcher, policy maker, program leader, et cetera, you can pay attention to the power dynamics at play in your own role and continue to check yourself. So validating the experiences of people who share their experiences with you, even if it's not something that you yourself have experienced, is a really important part of this process. And there's just a little bit of contact info if you want to follow up with me. And now I will pass it over to Roberta Rincon, who is the Manager of Research for SWE, and she's going to share some really important findings from the research that SWE has conducted over the past year.
Thank you, Heather. Following in this vein of intersectionality, I wanted to start off with a study that SWE had collaborated with the National Society of Black Engineers on to understand the experiences of minority women in the early career stage of their engineering career. And one of the driving forces behind this is just the fact that there's so few non-white or minority women in the engineering workforce today. Black women, Hispanic women, Native American women, Asian women together make up less than 5% of the engineering workforce right now. So we conducted a qualitative study. We interviewed 31 women who had about 2 to 5 years of experience after receiving their engineering degrees. And we really wanted to understand the obstacles, the challenges that they were experiencing in that stage, and the support systems that were helping them get through it, and the role that professional associations played in that. Some of the challenges that they talked about was, and it's been mentioned by other speakers, is the difficulty of fitting in. And really this went beyond just the workplace. A lot of these women, after graduating, they relocated for work. And so they felt a bit isolated, not just within the workplace, but within the community, and trying to understand who they could socialize with and how to make those sort of connections and networks. They also experienced some gender and race-based biases within the workplace, as well as sometimes within the community, but the workplace biases in particular had some effects on how comfortable they felt in the workplace environment with their coworkers, as well as how they felt they were being treated with regards to performance evaluations, compensations, and such. And with regard to compensation, we did ask them about salary negotiations and how many of them had actually negotiated their salary for that first position. And about 60% of them indicated that they hadn't negotiated salary, about 70% of them indicated they hadn't negotiated benefits. So what that basically led to was, even though they were feeling pretty happy about receiving that first job offer, they get into the workplace and they realize that the peers that they came in with, or those that came after them who had negotiated, they were receiving more money. And so that already puts them behind. And as they continue and they get their performance evaluations, they feel that they're doing a good job. They're getting good feedback from their management, from their coworkers. But then at the time of performance evaluations, they feel that they're not getting honest feedback. They're not getting a clear understanding of what it is they need to improve in order to get that salary or that promotion that they had been told they were up for, or they had been told that they were sort of in position for. So that happened about one-third we heard that from about one-third of the women that we interviewed with. Some of the support systems that they talked about turning to, now some of them did have family members who were engineers, which is always extremely helpful to have some kind of role model in your family who's encouraging you. But a lot of them who would talk about the help that they received from their universities, career fairs that they went to, alumni that they talked with, that helped them with resume reviews, mock interviews, helped them prepare for that first, finding that first position. Mentors within the workplace, outside of the workplace, in college, as well as after, were hugely beneficial for those that did have them. And there were, within our interviewees, a number of them who were really, really good at developing those networks. And those that were, you could see in the responses that they had how beneficial that was to their own career advancement. Colleagues and coworkers, for the most part, many of the women that we talked to discussed the fact that when they first entered, it was difficult for them to sort of find their voice, and some of them never really did. They felt a bit less confident in speaking up, but those that would and kind of pushed through, developing the trust among the coworkers and colleagues ended up helping them feel even more emboldened to speak up. So they developed those trust networks, those trust relationships, and then when they would speak up, they had others who would back them up. And usually that was sort of like one-on-one relationships that they developed. They identified people within their workplace that they felt comfortable with and knew could assist them in that way. And then professional associations, a number of them talked about attending conferences like this SWE conference and going to career fairs and networking, and the family that they developed, they had, especially when they were in college. Now, suggestions for professional associations that they had included having leadership that reflect what we want our organizations to look like. Now, this was the National Society of Black Engineers, the Society of Women Engineers. We have In some cases, we lack some gender diversity. We lack age diversity was a huge one that was mentioned among leadership. We lack racial and ethnic diversity in some cases. Helping women find professional chapters after job relocation was one thing that was mentioned by a number of women we spoke with. They, in some cases, went to college in a very urban location. They had this strong SWE or NSBE chapter and this family atmosphere, and then they go off and get this first job, and they don't know, they don't have that anymore. The closest chapter to them is an hour and a half away, and they don't know where to turn. They don't know how to continue that family relationship. Provide better access to events and diversify event options. We heard a couple of people say, I really don't want to go to another happy hour. I want more professional development. I want more, just something other than just that social networking, although that is important. They want to participate in more outreach activities. They want some diversity so that they feel that they're getting some benefit and value from their association with NSBE, with SWE, with SHIP. And they need more mentors who are willing to share their experiences with failure. And I think we all have experienced failure. We all make mistakes. And how hard that is when that happens for the first time in your job. Knowing that it's not just you, that this happens to everybody and you will overcome it. Having people share those stories more often is something that they said would be very beneficial. So the bottom line with this study was minority women need to know their own worth and be given the tools to advocate for themselves. And I think that there's a real role to play by professional associations like SWE. So now I want to jump into this next study that we're just wrapping up around community college transfers. We needed to understand how successful women on this pathway are, because as an organization, we're interested in supporting them better. What was frustrating was the lack of data available around this in this area. So we went ahead and did a quantitative study using data from the Texas Education Research Center, because it's extremely robust. They collect data from across all public institutions in the state. So we looked at 10 first-time in college cohorts. This is a little bit different look at student success. Usually you hear 4-year graduation rates, 6-year graduation rates. What we're looking at is you enter in the year 2002, 2003. By year 2015, have you transferred, have you graduated? So in Texas, between 160,000 and 190,000 students enter for the first time in college 2-year and 4-year each year. Consistently over 50% female, not a surprise. Among those that do start, 20% of men and about 4% of women, 2-year and 4-year, declare an ECS major, that ECS being engineering or computer science. And kind of following national trends, if you look at just the ECS majors, about 20% of them or less are women. So looking specifically at transfer students, in Texas, it's about 21,000 women per year transfer from 2-year to 4-year, about 17,000 men per year transfer. Among those, less than 2% of women who transfer declare an ECS major, compared to 11% of men. This is looking at the success of those students, like how many of those that transferred actually ended up receiving an ECS degree, a bachelor's degree. The numbers are extremely small. If you think about less than 2% of 21,000 students, about roughly 500 women per year out of these cohorts are transferring and majoring in ECS. About half of those, roughly, are actually earning bachelor's degrees. In a state as large as Texas, as diverse as Texas, one of the things that was mentioned about access to data, it was impossible to really break down and look at, okay, how many African American women are there? How many Hispanic women? How many are going part-time and full-time? Those numbers are so small. So this is kind of the best I could do. About 200 women each year are transferring and successfully graduating in engineering and computer science. Now this doesn't mean that they're not graduating. Some of them are graduating, but not with their ECS degree. They may be declaring an ECS major in community college. They may transfer and declare it at the university level, but all along the way, we're losing them. So this was basically the bottom line. About 1,300 over this 10-year period, 1,300 women transferred and graduated with bachelor's degrees in ECS. Less than 10% of those were Black women, about 35% Hispanic. So it's a little depressing, but at the same time, there's so much opportunity here. There's so much potential, because 40 to 50% of undergraduates right now who enroll in college are enrolled at community colleges. Over 80% of them want to finish their bachelor's degrees. And when they do transfer, they do receive their degrees. So how do we keep them there? How do we keep them interested and engaged and continuing towards their ECS degrees? Because this is a very, very promising way for us to diversify the engineering profession. So the next step in this particular study is understanding the why and the how. So we have this picture of what it looks like, but what can we do as a professional association to help encourage more women to stay? So we're going to be doing some focus groups, some one-on-one interviews, do a qualitative study to get to some of those answers. Some other research projects we've got going on. We had wrapped up a US gender and racial bias study last year. We're doing a similar one in India. And so we're hoping to be able to compare and contrast what we find over there against what we found here. We're also doing a project around our SWE Next members, which are our K-12 membership group, really looking specifically at the high school students and the development of an engineering identity. So they're joining SWE Next, they're interested in engineering. What factors are impacting their decisions to actually major in engineering when they get to college? So we'll hopefully be following those girls and learning a little bit more to help us understand the influence of peer and media on their decisions. Thank you, and I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Imelda Castro, who is the Director of Equipment Workforce Capability at Intel Corporation, to share a little bit about how companies can use data and research to help improve diversity.
Thank you, Roberta and Heather. All three of us are a little vertically challenged here. So I'm going to start with the bottom line at Intel. So back in 2015 at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, our CEO, Brian Krzanich, announced a pretty aggressive goal that Intel wanted to reach full representation of all women and underrepresented minorities by 2020. So he also challenged the rest of the tech industry that Intel will get there, we want all of you to get there. So I've been at Intel over 30 years, and what I know of Intel is when we set aggressive goals, we will achieve them. So in that spirit, this year, Brian came back to Intel and said, I am pulling in that goal, and I want you to get there by the end of 2018. So I'm going to share with you how we got to that commitment. So what you're going to see is external data. I'll talk about our internal diversity research as well. Then share with you our diversity strategies as well as the progress on how close are we to our 2018 goal. So the background on this, back in about 2014, we worked closely with Dalberg Global Development Advisors, and we conducted a study on the economic returns of diversity in the tech industry. So this was the first one that had been done in the tech industry. And the data was collected from 170 US technology companies that ranged from having 1,500 employees up to 150,000 employees. The study showed that improving our ethnic and gender diversity in the technology workforce has an economic opportunity, and it's pretty massive. The study was based on regressive analysis, and our full report is available on Intel.com. So I do encourage you to take a look at it. It's about 50 pages long. It's very comprehensive. I'm going to share 3 examples from that study. The first one is just an overview of diversity in the U.S. technology workforce by gender. So what this shows is, if you look at our population in the U.S., it's 52% female. When you look at the labor force, it is 47%. Then when you look at that labor force and you look at the technology sector, it is 28%. So that shows that we have a gap of 700,000 women relative to the labor force from a technical perspective. The second one is, so one of the challenges that I have seen with diversity at tech companies is you've got to show what is the business impact of diversity. So you're going to show 3 slides from this data. The first one, what this study showed was that every incremental percentage point in our representation of African Americans and Hispanic at the NASDAQ listed tech companies is linked with a 3% increase in revenues. So what that means is our revenue is roughly about $1.4 trillion. If we were diverse, that would correlate to a 24% increase up to $1.8 trillion. Now, what the study shows is that there are correlations. It's not necessarily a causation, but across the board, this is the pattern that we saw in the study across our technology sectors. If you look at the economic returns on gender diversity in terms of women at the senior leadership level, this also correlates with a 13 to 16% higher enterprise value for company revenues, for profitability, size, and range. So again, looking at the numbers from 3.9 trillion to 4.2 trillion dollars. And the third example is recognizing that technology companies serve a very global marketplace in terms of our customers, our suppliers. We looked at the financial impact of gender diversity from a global perspective. And what we found is when you close the global gender leadership gap, that this could add from 0.5 to 0.6% to our global GDP. So this is equal to an economy that is the size of Norway. Okay. What we found was in the study, when we looked at the root causes of diversity challenges in technology, what we identified is there is not one single silver bullet. Instead, we have to look at this in a more holistic fashion. So when you think about the tech industry, what we saw were challenges in terms of visibility. So this is the lack of role models and sponsorship in companies, a limited access and exposure to careers. When you look at the pathways, in terms of women and underrepresented minorities entering the industry, we see that there's an underrepresentation in computer science and engineering, very similar to what you heard our panelists talk about. There's also lower expectations among teachers and unequal access to classes and facilities. So that's the environment coming in. And then from a culture perspective, once we have women and underrepresented minorities in our technology companies, what the study showed was somewhat of unsupportive and lack of inclusive work environment. And the study also showed that there's a bias in the interview as well as our resume review processes. So that's a snapshot of the 50 pages that you will see. So in addition to that, at Intel, we completed 2 comprehensive women's and multicultural retention and progression studies. And these were used to formulate Intel's diversity strategy. The Intel study was done probably about 5 or 6 years ago, and the multicultural study was done about a year ago. What I'm going to do now is I am going to share with you what the strategy actually looks like, and then how we're doing relative to our representation goals. So bottom line with Intel is we want to be a leader in diversity and inclusion, and we believe by being a leader, that will help us to transform Intel and to grow Intel. We also want to encourage the rest of the technology industry to do likewise. So we have 5 strategies: achieving full workforce representation, leading with inclusion, growing our Intel workforce, drive thought leadership, and then the overall ecosystem development. I'm going to talk about a few of these in a little bit more detail. So the first one is to achieve full workforce representation. So within that, the strategies, the first one is to accelerate our diverse hiring. So part of what we're doing there is we are recruiting at colleges who are more diverse. We are also attending the right conferences, such as SWE, to target some of our recruiting. We also have focused a lot on the unconscious bias that we have all talked about. So even with our hiring managers, we spend time with them and have put together inclusive hiring strategies to minimize that bias in our hiring practices. In terms of retaining our diverse talent that is at Intel, we have a number of strategies here. We've got active sponsorship programs in place. We've got one-on-one mentoring. We've got mentoring circles. We have 30 active employee resource groups. And we also have 9 leadership councils. I am a part of the Intel Hispanic Leadership Council, and the councils are made up of the most senior leaders at Intel. Just to give you an example, the women's employee group, it is the largest of the 30 employee resource groups, and we have about 5,500 members there. In terms of advancing careers, so one of the areas that I'm really proud of, and I did hear about the promotion and pay equity challenge in our study. So in 2016, we're very proud that we have achieved full parity for our women and URM from a promotion and advancement perspective. Also, in terms of promotional opportunities, We do look at this at the entry level, the mid-level, on the senior level, and we are continuing to increase at that level as well. A really good example is the highest level of technical advancement that anybody at Intel can achieve is becoming a fellow. And this year, 1/3 of our fellows that were nominated and that were approved were technical females. And the last one, of course, is just our overall focus on fostering inclusion across our entire organization. One of the areas of focus there is we do believe that it starts with the managers. And this year we have embarked on a program to train every one of our 14,000 managers on a Managing at Intel 2-day course, and a part of that does include inclusion practices. The next area is around growing the pipeline of our diverse talent. We are focused very closely with our educational systems and transforming some of those solutions. A really good example is the work that we are doing with the Oakland Unified School System, where we are working with them to create a comprehensive approach that involves the students, the parents, the teachers, and the entire community. And the program includes working with the students, providing work-study programs with the goal when they go on to college and they graduate to have a career at Intel or a technology company. And one of the ways that we're doing that is promoting STEM courses. So this year, as an example, at the Oakland School District, they had about 400 students that were in computer science. And fast forward, about a year later, we're up to 2,800. So a really good case study there. We're also activating, thank you, we're also activating our employee base. So our employees are very involved in our community. An example for our Hispanic population, we have a program called Las Hermanas, where we actually go into the community colleges and we invite high school Latinas to come into a one-day workshop where we start to introduce them to careers and to STEM fields. We also desire to create that blueprint for the tech industry because we recognize that we can't do it all on our own. We want to be leaders, but we want the rest of the tech industry to follow us. And we have a number of programs coming forward in the future. We've got some initiatives with funding some of our historically Black universities and colleges as an example. We are also working in terms of the ecosystem on improving the diversity of our supply chain. So we also believe that diversifying our supply chain will create a greater value to our business. So when Brian challenged us with the goal to reach full representation, he also gave us a goal to spend $1 billion annually with diverse suppliers by 2020. And it's an area that we're continuing to track and making very strong progress in. We are also investing in diverse entrepreneurs. So we have an Intel Capital Diversity Fund, which is the largest fund of its kind. And we are investing $125 million over 5 years in women and minority-owned technical companies. And here are a few examples of the companies, the venture capital companies that we have assisted so far. So another example, supply chain is the organization that I am a part of. And when you think about our supply chain, we have one of the most complex and largest supply chains to the point that we have been recognized by Gartner as being in the top 10 for the past 6 consecutive years. So we would not be there if it were not for the talent that we're bringing into our supply chain. So to give you a sense, in the organization that I am a part of, over 50% of our workforce is technical. And like the rest of Intel, we are working on reaching our representation numbers for women and underrepresented minorities. So I'm going to talk now about the progress that we're making. So twice a year, Intel issues our diversity reports. So we're very transparent about our data and how we're doing. Our mid-year report, if you see the chart to your left, what it shows is when Brian announced the challenge, our gap to representation was 2,300 employees. And you'll see that arrow going down. So at mid-year, last quarter, our representation gap has improved by 65%. So we are 800 employees short of reaching full representation. Thank you. We have also surpassed our retention exit goals, which is another challenge that we heard here about our leaky pipeline. We've also instituted something called a warm line. And typically, a company gets data when an employee has left the company, but by that time it's too late. So what we have done is we have individuals who are trained and they are encouraged before they take that step to leave Intel to come and speak to a professional in that organization. And the individuals, what we have seen with over 1,500 cases that have come in, that we have had over a 90% success rate in retaining employees at Intel. I mentioned over 13,000 managers are being trained this year. We're meeting our supplier diversity goals, and we're continuing to invest in our ecosystem. Intel is all about data, and we are a company that focuses on accountability and transparency. And how we do that from a diversity perspective is we do publish our diversity and inclusion report twice a year. So it's available out there at Intel.com. Our goals are also incorporated in our Intel annual performance bonus. So again, it impacts every single employee, whether we're hitting our goals. There are weekly reports that are going to our CEO, so he manages this very, very closely. Our warm line services have been there to resolve some of the challenges that we've had. And we're also building very strong allies to sustain our efforts. So one thing that I have found, I'm very involved in our women's initiatives, in our Hispanic initiatives, and many of my peers who are passionate, we have found that we cannot do it all on our own. And one of the studies has indicated that we've got to have our Caucasian males supporting our initiatives. So we have a number of strong allies that are in place to be able to help us to do that. So if you want to learn more about what Intel is doing, I encourage you to go to intel.com/diversity.
My name is Ann Perusik, and I'm SWE's Director of Editorial and Publications. And on behalf of SWE, I want to thank you for joining us to learn more about the state of women in engineering. The research discussed today allows us to better understand what's causing the gender gap in STEM. It allows us to identify initiatives to empower more women to pursue STEM and reach their fullest potential. Through internal research and due diligence as a society, we aim to remain an invaluable resource to the industry in order to be a catalyst for change. We invite you to learn more at WE17 by visiting our educational sessions, attending our panel discussions, and taking a look at our career fair, where you'll find hundreds of engineering companies looking for qualified engineering job candidates. WE17 represents community, friendship, and inspiration for women in engineering, and we look forward to sharing that with you. Okay, so thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And I'm sure if you have a question, if you want to have it addressed a little more informally with any of the panelists, they'd be happy to take the time to talk to you. Thank you.